Hi all, welcome to educators.com. I'm Harish, software engineer. In this session, we will learn about what is an object and different ways to create an object and properties. So by end of session, you should be able to understand how to create an object and what is object actually about and what are the different ways to create an object. Okay, what is an object? An object is a collection of properties, and a property is an association between a name and a value. So simple, the object is a collection of properties. So it can contain written properties or anything. You can map an object to a real-time world entity. Like it can be a cup where the properties can be the color, size, and width, and it can be anything. So what are the properties? It will, the characteristics of an object will become a properties of an object. So as we are mentioning like color and the white, so color becomes a property whereas the white becomes the value of the property. So here objects in JavaScript are similar to the objects in other programming languages. A JavaScript object has properties associated with it. Object properties are basically the same as ordinary JavaScript variables except for the attachment to objects. So defining the properties of an object is similar to defining variables, but those variables are attached to an object. Okay, so coming to how to create object and properties. In addition to the predefined objects, we can also create our own objects using the following methods like object initializers, constructor function, and object.create. JavaScript has some predefined objects like number, string, and object. So it has some like math, etc. So it has some predefined objects. So apart from these predefined objects, we can also define our own objects. So to define our own objects, these are the three methods. And one more thing is the name of the property can be an identifier, number, or string. So whatever be the property you are defining for an object, it can be the identifier, number, or string. So let's start with object initializers. So the syntax is simple using the object initializers. Like here you can check I declared a variable called object with the value as starting from the braces property 1 with value 1 and then property 2 with value 2. So this is how you declare an object using object initializers. So let's check with using identifiers. Identifiers are simply the name. Like here I declared a user details object with first parameter called first name with value as Will and then last name with value as Smith. Let's say using numbers has here I defined a user details object with first property as 1 with value Will and second property with value as Smith. And even in the similar with strings, like here I can use strings for the property names also. Like first name is defined within the string and last name within the string. So this is how you define an object initializes. But what is the disadvantage and advantage of using this object initializers? When you want to define a single object within your application, then you can go with this object initializers approach. But when you want to define more than one object of a particular structure, you cannot go with this approach as it will be creating only one object. Okay, so in order to go and define multiple objects of a particular structure, you should not use this object initializers approach. Okay, coming to constructor function. So the drawback of object initializers can be overcome with this constructor function. So the syntax here is I declared a function keyword with the constructor name and then the parameters which will be assigned to the properties of that object. Like here I'm passing some parameters and then I'm assigning these parameter values to the properties of the object. This denotes a here this denotes a current object. Like when you use a create an object. So whatever be the context or whatever be the code within this constructor function will be referring that object. So this refers to that object. Okay, like here we are defining some properties with values. Here in this example you can check that I declared a car constructor with arguments as make, model and year. And inside this constructor I defined 4 properties in which 3 are values and the other is method. Like here you can check that I declared a make property, model property and year property, and the values that are assigned are based on the argument values. And here at the bottom I defined the get model function which will return the value of model property. Okay, so at the bottom you can check that I'm creating the object using this constructor with the keyword new, whereas you can check this object initializes you don't use any new keyword. Whereas coming to constructor function syntax, when you try to create a new object you need to use a new keyword with the constructor function name and the arguments if you want to pass to that function or not. Okay, here this refers to the current object. So whatever be the property is available within the property. Like for example, I declared the function called getModel. Since getModel is also a property of this object, it will have an access to the property using the this keyword. Like now it is returning the model value of that object using the this keyword as a reference. Okay, so this is how we declare the constructor functions. But one of the disadvantages here, when you declare a functions within the constructor and when you create an objects of this based on this constructor, it will create the functions also. Okay, so to avoid this multiple creations of functions and to use some common code of functions, as most of the functions at each and every time the functions logic will be same for each and every object which is created based on that constructor. So to avoid that a creation each and every time, you can define that value as a property to a prototype object. So prototype is a common thing which will be shared across all objects. We'll be discussing about the prototype in the later sessions. So here I declared a prototype property which has an object with a property value as getModel. So when I try to create more than one object, it will be created only with 3 properties each and every object, but not with the function again, because these are shared properties across all the objects. Okay, so this is how we use a constructor function to create multiple objects of same structure. So coming to object.create. So apart from that object initializer and constructor function syntax, we also have an object.create method, where this method can be used to create an object based on the prototype object for the object we want to create. This means, let's say in this example I declared a details object with 2 properties called name and display function. So when I try to create an object based on the existing details object, I can use a create method. Like here you can check I'm using the object.create based on the details object. So it will create me an object and it will return the object. So when I try to set the property of user details dot name as JSON and then display, call the display method, it will give the output as JSON. Okay. So apart from this, let's check this other example using the prototype. Here I declared a function with two properties for first name and last name, and then it has a prototype with a method called print full name. So it will return the first name and last name. So when I try to create an object based on the constructor prototype, it will just create an object of this prototype, not the constructor. So that's why when I try to create only the prototype, pass the prototype and not the parameters, it will be creating the object. But when I call this print full name function, this values first name and last name values will be undefined, as those values are not available within that created object. So that's why object.create will accept two parameters. One is a prototype and from which you want to create an object, and the second is properties. Okay, so how to define these properties? Those properties are defined as an objects also. Like first name is our name of the property, and then within that we have the attributes of that object. So we define the values for the attributes of that property. Like here I'm declaring the value property with the value as will. So the first name property value will be will. So this is the way you need to create an object if you want to use or share the logic of some existing object. Okay, let's flip to bracket server. Here first we'll go through the object initializers. So let's create an user details object with properties like first name with value as will, and then last name property with value as Smith. Okay, so this is one way of creating the way object. So we can also use numbers as properties. Like in this example, let's declare user details with numbers. Okay, so let's declare the same as first with value as will, and then the second parameter with value as Smith. Okay, so apart from these two ways, we also have the other way called using strings for property names. Like here, let's declare the first name property with will, and then last name with as Smith. So these all three are valid ways of creating an object. Okay, so but in the next section we will learn about how to access these properties using the notations in JavaScript. Okay, first apart from this, let's create an constructor function. So before going to constructor function, as I mentioned before, using this object initializers, we will be able to create only one object. But uh, if you want to create more objects, you should go through constructor function. So let's declare a constructor function called car with three properties called make, model, and then year. Okay. So let's assign these values to the properties of the constructor. So this dot make and this dot model is equal to model, and then this dot year equals to year. Okay, So here this denotes the current object. Here this denotes the current object. Whereas this year equal to year, the right hand side year denotes the arguments which have been passed to this constructor function. Okay. So this is how you create the constructor function. So let's create the prototype also for this constructor function. Okay. Like get model, which will return the function return of this dot model. As I mentioned before, if you declare this function within the constructor itself, it will be created each and every time for each object. So whereas if you assign that function to the prototype, it will be shared across all the objects. So that's the main advantage of using the function for a given prototype or within the constructor itself. Okay. So first let's create an object for this constructor. New car of let's say eagle, and then Dalson, and then the year as 1995. Okay, 1 second, 1995. So let's try to call this method get model. Okay, document dot write of new car dot get model. Okay, so let's check this in the document. So here you can check it has printed the model value. Okay, so this is how the constructor function and the prototype works. So now let's try to create the same constructor function using the its prototype with the object.create method. Okay, so let's try to create like where new car model is equals to object.create. Okay, with the car prototype, and then the properties as model. It can be anything. Okay, now let's print document.write new car model dot get model. Okay, so let's check the output. So looks like something has went wrong. Okay, here we defined it in this way. This is not the correct way. Actually, we need to define with the attributes like a value and then this one. Okay, see, now you can check the value. So when you use this object.create method, we need to use the prototype for constructor, and then the properties need to be passed in terms of an object with attributes as value, enumerable, and anything, which we'll be discussing about in the later sessions. Okay, so this is how you can create the objects in three ways, like using the object initializers, using the constructors, or using the prototype of an existing constructor with the help of object.create method. Okay, so this is how the creation of objects. That's all from this session. Thank you.